China is emerging as a global leader in development finance. We'll discuss what this means for China, the United States, and the world. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. China is already the world's largest trading nation and the second largest economy. And in the next few years, analysts say it's likely to emerge as the world's largest creditor. A new study finds China now has a bigger presence in international development finance than all of the world's 6 major financial institutions put together. The Chinese Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China loaned an estimated $684 billion globally in 2014. We begin our coverage now with CCTV's Yang Zhao from Beijing. And Zhao, it's unusual for a developing country to become a major investor, but that's exactly what China has accomplished. Is this all part of China's Go Global strategy?
Well, Alan, the Go Global policy was introduced 20 years ago. It was primarily a policy aimed at encouraging better exports, but gradually evolved into the strategic plan to export not only Chinese-made products, but also capital, technology, talents, and labor forces. In fact, China's outbound investment surpassed domestic investment for the first time in 2014. And 2 banks that you mentioned, the Chinese Development Bank and the Import-Export Bank of China, are the 2 main institutions of China's export finance infrastructure. Increasingly, direct loans has been seen in recent years to support foreign projects, especially to countries involved with the Belt and Road Initiative. The Silk Road Fund and AIIB have just started operations, and both will pump more money into the market. The result of that is, of course, more outbound investment. The Chinese Commerce Ministry has said that compared to last year, China's non-financial outbound direct investment rose 62% in the January to May period to 480 billion yuan, or $73 billion. The majority of investment is in energy, transportation, and technology. And more evidence to prove this trend is China selling off the U.S. government debt it holds. Though China is still the largest foreign holder of U.S. treasuries now, is experiencing a decline. In May 2015, after 6 consecutive months of selling, China was actually the number 2 holder. That means China has changed their policy on how to use large foreign reserves and move them into other areas which yield higher returns.
Now, Zhao, China and the United States have been negotiating a bilateral investment treaty. What's the latest on that?
Well, representatives from both sides just concluded the 8th China-U.S. Strategic and Economic Dialogue in Beijing last week. They agreed to exchange new negative list offers this week. There will be the 3rd negative list. The last time the 2 sides exchanged the list was in early September last year, ahead of the Chinese President Xi Jinping's state visit to the United States. The list is the key part of the bilateral investment treaty between China and the U.S. to prevent firms from investing in critical sectors. Neither side wants companies with key technologies to leak knowledge to the foreign country or edge out domestic firms. That's where the negative list comes in. The focus of negotiations has been to keep the list as short as possible. So both sides are very, very cautious about each and every item that is on that list. That's why the negotiation process is so slow. There have been 24 rounds of the talks in the last 8 years. China has been the United States' biggest trading partner since 2015, with a total trade volume of $55.8 billion. The both sides wish to agree on a deal before President Obama leave their office.
Okay, thanks, Zhao. That's CCTV's Yang Zhao reporting from Beijing. Joining us now in our Washington, D.C. studio is David Dollar. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and the author of China as a Global Investor. From Sao Paulo, we're joined by Charles Tang. He's the chairman of the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And here in Washington is Yukon Huang. He's a senior associate in the Carnegie Asia program. Welcome to all of you. David, let me start with you. Lots of things happening in the Chinese economy. Growth predicted to be around 6%, but the economy is also transitioning from one based on manufacturing exports to one based on domestic consumption. But by the year 2020, China's going to be the world's largest investor. How significant is that?
It's a very big change for the world. China has been investing abroad for a while. Some of this has come on gradually. But in the last couple of years, the scale of China's outward investment has really become quite tremendous. And so I'm projecting that by 2020, China will be the largest net investor in the world. Net is an important adjective there. The U.S. is still the biggest investor in the world, but because there's so much inward investment into the U.S. and purchasing of U.S. treasuries as reserves, the U.S. is a net debtor. But China will be the largest net creditor in the world, and it's providing a lot of different types of financing. Most of that's quite welcome. And particularly countries are very open to direct investment when Chinese firms come in and open factories or buy up existing factories. So this is a pretty important phenomenon in the world.
So Yukon, China becomes the world's biggest net investor, as David has been pointing out. Does that change the status quo in terms of which country is generating the most world investment?
Well, you go back for the last 10 or 20 years, China was either the number one or number two in receiving money from abroad. Its foreign outward flows have only surfaced in the last 7 or 8 years. It's getting very, very big, as David has mentioned. It's going to a very wide geographic mix of countries. Africa, Latin America, Europe, Asia, States, and for a variety of different purposes, whether it's commodities, energy, or to support trade. And I just want to mention trade, because here's, of course, China's real strengths, both in terms of its ability to exports and the fact that it imports a lot of commodities and imports a lot of components from a wide variety of sources, and is now trying to further that chain. And I think this is going to have a very significant impact on many countries throughout the world.
Right, you mentioned all those places where Chinese investment is going. One of the biggest recipients of Chinese investment is Brazil. Let's go to Charles Tang in Sao Paulo for some information on that. Charles, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang announced investment deals in Brazil worth $50 billion. And among the new investments, we'll see a new metro being built in Rio de Janeiro, other infrastructure projects. How significant is this investment for Brazil?
Well, it's very significant, especially now where the Brazilian economy has slowed down tremendously because of the political uncertainties. The fact that China is still investing strongly into Brazil sends a very strong message that, Brazil is a wealthy country. Temporarily, it has political problems, which has generated economic problems. But now all the assets are very cheap because of the situation. And the Chinese companies, thinking strategically, are investing in a massive way. We're looking at power plants. We're looking at hydroelectric power plants. We're looking at shipyards for the petroleum and gas industry, etc. And all the transmission lines from the Belo Monte to the southeast is being done by State Grid. So I think that the Chinese have the right perception that right now it's the best time to invest in Brazil. And really, because of all the Chinese investments in all of Latin America and in the Caribbean, I wrote an article, the World Policy Institute of New York, where I alluded to the fact that America's backyard is building a Chinese garden, is growing a Chinese garden.
David, what does all this investment tell us about the state of China's economy?
Well, it says both good and bad things about China's economy. China has a very high savings rate. They've invested that primarily at home through most of the recent decades. But now their investment opportunities are diminishing. They've built up a lot of excess capacity. Real estate is most obvious, lots of empty apartments, whole empty cities. But manufacturing has excess capacity and declining profitability. So part of this exodus of capital from China reflects diminishing opportunities back at home, and that reflects some weaknesses in the Chinese economy.
Yukon, the Chinese-led Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, they will announce their first loans later this month. And in a daily newspaper, these investments will include solely financed projects and those co-financed with the World Bank, as well as the Asian Development Bank. How does this kind of investment fit in with China's very ambitious, broader One Belt, One Road plan?
I see these as always complementary. AIIB is designed to focus on infrastructure. In the future, they might go into other areas. But you also have funds which are going to go support the private sector. You have direct lending from the China Development Bank or the Export-Import Bank, and they're going into many infrastructure projects in South Asia, the Middle East, all the way through to Europe. Central Asia is getting a lot of attention. AIIB plays one important critical role, and it plays a critical role because it's basically a multilateral agency. So it's going to have different kinds of approaches and standards, and I see this as complementing the funds that flow through what I would call the Chinese bilateral programs.
And Charles, Brazil at the moment is facing its worst recession in 2 decades. You've got something like 11 million people unemployed. How do these Chinese investments help Brazil?
Well, by creating jobs, by bringing in much needed capital. We can just take a look at Africa, where the former colonial masters of Africa stripped the continent of its wealth and left it as a lost continent for many decades until China started investing massively into Africa. And now it has transformed the continent into a continent of hope. The fastest growing countries in the world are African nations, where China invested hugely in the last 6 years. You can see the growth rates. And in Brazil, and all over Latin America, much needed investment is being made by China. And with regard to Chinese economy, I personally am not pessimistic, because when they talk about the massive non-performing loans by the local governments, we must remember that China, by and large, except for 3 trial projects in Beijing, Guangzhou, and Shanghai, does not have property tax. If all the local governments start charging 1% property tax, they can probably repay the banks 10 times. And the present Brazilian government, I just had lunch with the chief minister of Brazil, of the interim government that replaced President Dilma Rousseff. And what they want to do with Brazil makes a lot of sense, by reducing costs, by selling off all the assets. Chinese state-owned companies, some of them are quite profitable, and a lot of them can become problems, non-performing loan problems for the banks. But if they hold very, very valuable assets around the world, if they sell those assets, they can probably repay their bank loans twice. So I'm not so pessimistic. I believe that China will continue to grow in a solid way. Of course, no longer in double digits, but 6-7% is just.
Okay, we are going to have to take a break right now. More of our conversation about China's global investments right after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Well, welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing China's footprint in global investment. Joining us in our discussion from London is Linda Yue. She's an adjunct professor of economics at the London Business School and the author of China's Growth, the Making of an Economic Superpower. And we're joined by the rest of our guests as well. Linda, let me start with you this time. We were talking earlier on about the changing economy in China. China is transitioning from an economy based on manufacturing and exports to one based on domestic consumption. How will China's overseas investments help that transition?
It can help it in a very specific way, which is in terms of upgrading China's technology. So one of the keys to China's very challenging transition into an economy which is led much more by productivity, efficiency, which is all very consistent with relying on its own growth drivers, rather than in an earlier stage of growth where it relied on export orientation and foreign investors coming into China itself and learning from that process to upgrade its industry. This next phase requires Chinese companies to be more technically advanced, technologically competitive. And if you look at Chinese multinationals which are competing out in Asia and in the world, Tencent, Alibaba, Huawei, the world's biggest telecoms company, that gives you a flavor of how it is that some of these Chinese companies are trying to show that their wares are as good as perhaps other global companies. And China needs companies like this to show it can upgrade its economy. And it's not just on the technology and industry side. Another important part of China's transformation into an upper middle income country is developing the services sector. So it's not mainly reliant on industry. And services expertise is also much more prevalent in markets, especially in Western Europe and in the United States. So China's outward investment tends to be in these areas: services, financial services, as well as in technology, along with their long-standing investment in resources. But now I think the big difference is private companies competing globally. And if we do see a lot of Chinese multinationals, which are as technically competitive as, say, the Apples or the Googles of the world, then that would tell you a lot about the success of China's own difficult transformation into a upper middle income country, as I say, driven a lot more by productivity than in the past.
And Linda, what about innovation? We've been hearing a lot of talk about innovation, that China has to move from just being a manufacturing center to being one that innovates. What future do you see for innovation in China?
It's key. It's one of the reasons why Chinese firms are so keen to patent, which is one form of measuring formal innovation. So if you look at worldwide, the top 5 patent filers globally in terms of companies, 3 out of the 5 are Chinese companies. Now, there is a big task for any country to push for innovation, because innovation, if it were easy to do, we'd be looking at a very different economy. And so some of the research with colleague at the London School of Economics, we've looked at how much China's innovation comes from technology transfer, so in other words, foreign sources. And a good chunk of it does, up to possibly 2/3. So that means that Chinese firms domestically innovating without foreign technology, I think, is still a massive challenge. I mentioned a moment ago a few Chinese tech firms like Huawei, which has been had some controversy as well in terms of the United States and Australia in terms of their relationship with the Chinese state. But I think these kinds of companies are very focused on innovation. They'll spend something like 10% of their revenues into their R&D budget. But if you talk to these big companies like I have, what they say uniformly is China needs 50, 100 of these before you could say that they have enough innovation, enough domestic capacity to raise technical advances that improve the overall efficiency of an economy. You can't just look at a handful.
Okay. David, let's look at the relationship, investment relationship between China and the United States. The two sides are currently are negotiating a bilateral investment treaty. Some sectors will be close to each side, the so-called negative list, as it's called. Now, that treaty will have to be approved by the U.S. Congress. And given the current political climate, do you expect it to be approved?
I think the current political climate is difficult in the United States, but the big issue at the moment is China needs to make a good offer. You know, just this week, China's come with a new offer on the negative list. That's confidential. We don't have detailed information, but I'm pretty confident there's still a lot of sectors on that negative list. You know, Linda raised some really interesting, important issues. A lot of these Chinese firms going out are service sector firms and technology firms. And one problem is that China itself remains relatively closed to direct investment in those sectors. So China is not allowing real competitive markets to develop in many of those areas, and yet its firms are going out. And this is becoming a problem for partners like the U.S. U.S. is actually the biggest recipient of China's direct investment if you leave aside Hong Kong. So a lot of Chinese investments coming to the U.S., but the U.S. side is concerned that there's no reciprocity. So I think if China made a good offer, meaning it would open up most of these sectors, I think the business community in the U.S. could get a bilateral investment treaty through Congress. I don't expect that negotiation to be finished in the next few months, so I don't really have to answer what happens in the next few months. But if there's a good agreement within, say, 12 months, politics in the U.S. are uncertain, but there's a good chance that the business community could get that through whatever Congress emerges from the next election.
Right, in Yukon, there is not that great deal of investment from developing countries into China itself. It remains closed to many foreign direct investments. There are some sectors that have opened up because of China's membership of the WTO, but do you think investments into China will grow significantly?
Well, I think it'll continue to grow. You go historically. China's export industries were created by foreign investment. And China's money that's coming in from places like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan still remains substantial. I think a lot more ASEAN money is coming in many of these developing countries. So I see it as clearly a very strong source. Going back to your earlier question about the politics of the investment treaties, in some ways it's less sensitive than trade issues. Trade issues are highly politicized here in the United States. But with the bilateral investment treaty, you have a situation where the American economy is relatively open and the Chinese economy is relatively restricted. So an agreement which opens up China to the United States will be politically very welcome, and also be in China's interest. So I see this as a very positive thing. But there are also sensitive issues. There's issues about technology transfer, concerns about intellectual property rights protection. And these are also very sensitive issues in China. So if you can get these things correct, I think both sides can see this as potentially a so-called win-win possibility. More so, frankly speaking, than trade, which has become much more of a contentious issue in the global environment.
Yeah, go ahead, Charles.
I think that if the United States learned a little bit from the UK on how to engage in a constructive fashion with China, the US businesses would make a lot more money. It would be much more profitable. You know, rather than trying to isolate China in the AIIB or in the TPP, I think that, you know, the UK has become the largest and Chinese business partner in Europe. And I think that if the United States were to have such agreements with China to open up both sides, I think that American business would be the first to profit more.
Linda, there has been some criticism of China with regard to environmental and social safeguards. What are your views with this regard, as it comes to China's investments in the developing world?
I think there is a real question as to whether or not an investor into a developing country in particular should come with higher standards than what that country itself is able to implement. So I think there is a debate to be had around investment rules, which at the moment, globally, there aren't really any hard and fast ones, but there are standards which around the environment, around labor, which I think that lots of developing countries would probably ultimately benefit if they were to embrace them. So I think that is an area that I wouldn't single out China, but given how big it is as an investor, there is an opportunity there to lead by example, I think.
Right. What is your view on that, David?
I think the Chinese attitude of going in and following the rules and regulations of the country it's in, it has a certain logic. But as Linda said, you know, we've got many developing countries. Some of them have relatively weak implementation of their own standards. So I think it is a good business practice to bring higher standards. Recently, some of China's agencies, like Ministry of Commerce, have put out recommendations, you know, that China bring higher standards into its projects. At the moment, that's a recommendation. I think it's a good step forward. I think Chinese companies will learn that it's in their interest to have good corporate social responsibility.
Right, and on that, Yukon, how do you see Chinese investment, global investment strategy evolving?
Well, in terms of these standards, first of all, let's differentiate the AIIB, which is a multilateral agency. So it has standards and its initiatives very similar to what you see in the World Bank and ADB, and I think that's a very good thing. Other Chinese sources of funding, China Development Bank, Export-Import Bank, have generally not been paying much attention to these areas. But as David says, it's probably a good thing for them to be more conscious of it, because the problems pop up later, and both sides actually suffer from the consequences of not having looked at it. I think the critical difference between a Chinese approach and, let me say, a Western approach is whether or not the Chinese are more willing to work with the recipients to try to get to better standards rather than trying to set a very black and white line. Because among developing countries, you have a wide variation in their ability to implement these standards. So I think that's one thing that's going to be different about Chinese funds overseas.
Right, Charles, I just want to get back to one other specific project. Yeah? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think one very distinct difference between the Western approach and the Chinese approach is that the United States and Europe basically have strings attached. You know, you can get their money if you behave in a certain way at your own home. Where the Chinese basically would like to know whether the business is good, profitable, or the investment can yield a return, and really don't really care to interfere into the internal affairs of other countries. Now, in Brazil, the environmental laws are very, very strict, and the Chinese companies have been adhering to the standards.
Linda, how unusual is it for a developing country to become the world's biggest investor in other developing nations?
Very unusual. But I would just chalk it up to another trait of China, which is pretty unique. I mean, how unusual is it for the world's second biggest economy to be still barely a middle income country on an average income basis? So I think in that sense, it's quite something. It's quite promising that development, which we consider to be, say, South-South links, is actually one of the big changes in the world, as opposed to developed countries investing in developing countries. So I think in that sense, China is part of this whole change in emerging markets. But in terms of how China treats its investment, I have spoken with African economists, for instance, about this issue. And one of the things that China itself very successfully did, which was to gain foreign investment via joint ventures, which allowed it to learn from working alongside foreign companies. That kind of technology transfer is part of that, but that just kind of informal learning by doing. It's a very important part of how it is that countries learn from better practices globally and lift themselves and grow better. And I think in terms of Africa, that's something that they're hopeful for from Chinese investment, because China certainly did it itself. But in some cases, I've heard, that hasn't been the case. So I think in that way, there is still quite a lot to develop in terms of what it means for China as a developing country to invest in these countries, because it does bring these issues to the table.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that's all the time we have for in this edition of The Heat. I'm Arun Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.